Hello, welcome to another session of decisions training. In today's session, we will explore on how exceptions are handled in decisions V8. With the help of today's session training, we would be able to get better understanding on decisions concepts like what is exception handling? Why is it important? Things to keep in mind while designing exception handling, steps around exception handling like throw exception, catch exception, log steps. Then we will explore on how to catch exceptions, hierarchy of exception handling, things to be done after catching on exception, general error patterns in decisions, data related errors, difference between throw exception and create data. And then finally, we would be looking into how we route after exception and the reporting. So in today's session, let's first understand all the various categories under exception handling and then switch into Designer Studio to test few exception handling techniques. So moving on to our next topic, that is why do we need exception handling, or what is an exception handling? When a project is working as expected, the customer is really happy. When something in a process does not go as expected, good error handling can be the difference between a customer that is still satisfied and the one who is very unhappy. So it is always important to make sure that any project we deliver includes solid error handling. Design exception handling is very important. So when we design exception handling, few things need to be always kept in mind. So one of the first things to think about when designing error handling is the end user experience. If something goes wrong in the process, I want to be assured that it is being taken care of. If I am an end user, I don't want to see a full stack trace, but I also don't want to fail silently with no indication that it did not run successfully. So the end user experience is very important. So just as important is making sure that these errors are recorded for troubleshooting. If a customer reports an error, we should be able to easily find the data on where it occurred and exactly what happened. So recording errors is also more important as equivalent to giving an end user experience. Finally, always keep in mind what happens next in the process. If the process is failed, if this is a months long approval, let's say in a case of a approval process, and this is a month long approval process, ending this flow early after an exception could be a disastrous. So in that case, we need to think on, does a single step need to be restarted, or does the entire process needs to be restarted? Can the flow end immediately? So all these questions must be answered to build a solid error handling. So to emphasize, while designing exception handling, end user experience, recording errors, and thinking what happens next is much more needed. Moving on to the next thing, the steps that are required or used in decisions while handling exception. So there are three steps, that is throw exception, catch exception, and log step. So these are the frequently used steps in exception handling. So to know more about throw exception, let's go into our next slide. So throw exception creates a user exception message that can be caught and logged in primary logs. So under throw exception, we also have other criterias or other categories like business rule exceptions or non-catchable exceptions as well. So under business rule exception, it creates a user's exception that can be caught, but adds business rule exception to the user created message. So this message is logged to the primary log file. Under throw non-catchable exception, This creates a user message that cannot be caught by the catch exception step. It displays the error message to the end user when the exception details on the steps are clicked on. So this message is not catched because this is a not catchable exception and it is not logged. While the other two steps, with the help of other two steps like throw exception as well as throw business rule exception, we would be able to log our exceptions in the primary log. Moving on to the next one, that is catch exception step. So the catch exception step catches the throw exception and throw a business rule exception step. The outputs of troubleshooting information, example, a flow ID, step ID or exception message, and a full stack trace are the key outputs of the catch exception step. Moving on to the log step. So the log step's primary intent is to write a message in the log file in decisions. It contains multiple logging categories like debug, info, warning, error, or fatal. So we can easily identify what type of error it is and take action depending upon the priority or the level of category that we have designed to that particular error. Like for example, fatal errors can be rerouted to a certain set of users. So these can be addressed immediately, while just an info can be an info to a specific users. Now, moving on to the next topic on how do we catch exceptions. So catch exception step, as mentioned earlier, is the backbone of our exception handling toolbox. If an error occurs, the catch exception is what we will pick it up. The catch exception step outputs all the data pertaining to the error that you will need. As mentioned earlier, the catch exception step has outcomes, and adding outcome for exception will allow us to capture or set up any type of process to this. All steps that have the option to enable step specific error handling are under outcome for exception. This will add another path coming out of the step. It will include data similar to the output of the catch exception step. Next is the specific error paths. So some steps have failed paths built into them. This will typically return an error message if the external connection had an issue, but the step itself didn't fail. So these are the three important things under catch exception, that is specific error paths, adding outcome for an exception, and catching exception step. So now let's understand more about exception handling hierarchy. So errors will always be handled at the lowest level possible. If a step has an exception path enabled, the error will be picked up here itself. If there is no specific path, the error will be picked up by the catch exception in the flow. If the flow has no error handling, the error will be picked up by the parent flow. If the parent most flow has no exception handling, the flow will end and the error will be exposed to the end user. So this is how the exception hierarchy works. So now let's understand what to be done when we catch an exception. So when we catch exception, there are different things that can be done. That there is an exceptional handling flow. These are a subflows which can be embedded into the primary flow once the exception is caught. Then there is logging, there is end user notification, there are assignments, email notifications, or we can also store the exception in the database. When we speak about exceptional handling subflows, the best practice for error handling is to build a standard subflow that can be reused throughout all the projects. This helps maintaining consistency and ensures all our errors are being logged together. So when we use exception handling subflows, always log first. Depending upon our needs, there may be a lot going on in our error handling flows. The first thing we should do is to log the error. An email step used to send a notification may fail due to delivery causing the initial error to never get logged if it happens afterwards. Next thing to keep in mind is add error handling to our error handling. Remember the principle that if something can go wrong, it will be going wrong. Make sure that if something fails in error handling process, we handle that error as well. This will often be a simplified process such as only logging. Don't call any other error handling flows recursively. So when we speak about exception handling subflows, two things to keep in mind are always log first, and the second foremost is even our exception handling subflows needs to have error handling inside that. It might be just a log, but we should ensure that it has a error handling capability inside it. Next, we have logging. At a minimum exception handling, it should always have a log step. Make sure to record identifying information about the process, such as case IDs or the primary IDs, and all the data returned from the catch exception step into the logging so that it would be easy for identification. Typically, exceptions will be set to the error level, but you may want to use one or fatal in some situations. So, one of the best practice that we do follow in decisions is always use logs as a key parameter to identify our exceptions. So the next important thing in our error handling is exception handling or error handling is end user notifications. Remember the first point that comes to in our mind, how do we send an information to the user on these error? This is how we notify them. So a user should not be left in the dark wondering if a flow has completed or not, or why it has failed in case if there were any exception. So in that case, end user notification is very important. We can either show a pop-up or an end form, or maybe trigger an email to them as a notification. So we don't want to confuse our end user with a full stack trace until and unless a customer has specific required interest in looking into those full stack trace. So have always keep in mind that we have to use a simple message or a subject that indicates them that this is the reason for exception or error. Now we have assignments. Often we will want to create an assignment in decision to alert administrators that something has gone wrong in the process. Error assignment should include details about the error from the catch exception step. Remember that assignments pause the flow. If you want your flow to move on without waiting for the assignment to be completed, you need to call the error flow asynchronously. If you want to pause the flow, so you can use the flow management dashboard to roll it back, an assignment will keep the flow active. Next is the email notification. As mentioned earlier, we can also notify the end users via email. So email notifications are always the common feature in error handling flows, especially if customer does not want an assignment but still wants a notification sent to be to them or someone. Storing information in database. So we also have the ability to store these exception into our database. Creating a data type to store errors allows us to easily report of what these errors are or when they have occurred. It also provides a place to record resolutions, so we have a holistic record of how problems have been solved. So now moving on to the next topic, that is general error patterns. So The first and foremost thing in a general error patterns is async flows. Errors occurs in async subflows will not be picked by a parent flow. Always make sure that any flow being called asynchronously has its own error handling. This also applies to flows which run in flows for a list of steps. Like a run flows for list of step also needs to have its own error handling step. Because the async flow is running in a fire and forget way, on exception paths will also not work. The async flows will always progress down the done path. So as depicted in this slide, always have an exception path for any of the errors and connect the error handling subflows to this exception path. Next, we have branch and merge. So this is one of the another commonly error handling patterns in decisions. So flows in branch existing early due to an exception cause an issue if they are picked by general error handling. Because the execution will jump into cast exception step, it can bypass the merge step, leaving the other branches stuck. Always make sure that flows running in a branch have error handling that allows every branch to complete. Next is process folder flows. So only having general error handling that routes to the end of the flow makes it very difficult to resume long running process flows. Make sure to break the process into sections with their own error handling. So as you see, the flow over here has a continuous set of process. So in any of the case, let's say there was an error, the flow will be caught only at the end step. So it's better to make each of this process into a subflow and have an exception at each of the subflow interval itself. So it makes easy to identify where the process had caught an exception and resolve those exception on timely basis. Next is the data flows or validation flows. Because data flows do not have the ability to run everything that a normal flow does, such as assignments, async flows, etc., the error handling for a data flow will be slightly different. Make sure you don't add a default error handling flow that has an assigned form. Always keep the user experience in mind. If something goes wrong in data flows, what should happen on the parent form? Does it provide key data? That means the form can't progress. Data flows that fail silently are very confusing to an end user if pushing a button produces no visible result. So make sure that the data flows have their own error handling as well. Moving on to the next one, that is loops. So when thinking about error handling and loops, it's important to keep in mind what needs to happen to the rest of the data yet to go through the loop if the current iteration fails. If one iteration failing means the whole process needs to be stopped, general error handling in the flow with the loop will work. If the loop needs to continue, even if one iteration fails, make sure to put the function in the loop into a subflow with its own error handling. Next is the API flows. A common practice with the flows designed to be called as a service is to use a throw API exception step. This step allows us to return a status code and a message back to the calling system. Keep a note that the throw exception or the throw API exception will be caught by a catch exception step. The best practice is to contain all your logic and error handling in a subflow. This subflow should have an error path that connects to the throw API exception step to return the error. The next thing that we are going to talk about today is about data related errors. So, in addition to handling exception that may occur in a flow, there is a second category of handling exceptions that also needs to be accounted for. These are data related errors. Data related errors occurs when data doesn't exist that should, or data exists that shouldn't, or any time data is in a state in your flow that shouldn't be possible but somehow happened. So the major reason for data related errors is using a fetch entity step. The fetch entity step has no results path and an outcome for a single result path for a reason. If your fetch should always have results, make sure the no results path has error handling. Sometimes this will be as simple as a notification to a user that has no data was found, and sometimes it will mean routing to the exception handling process and ending the flow. Example, if we have a subflow to populate a required dropdown on a form and no data can be fetched, don't show a user a form they will be unable to complete. Instead, alert them that something has gone wrong in the process and alert the admin group with that particular message for which the process has gone wrong. So the next thing is about data validations. Issues from data will not automatically be picked by a catch exception because decisions does not know how to validate our data by itself. The main exception to this rule is rules. Many of them have the option to throw an exception if the expected values are null. Make sure you disable this option if nulls should be allowed in your data. And now the next topic that we are going to discuss is throw exceptions versus create data. So there are times when you may want to route a flow to your exception process even though no exception has happened. The throw exception step can be used to act as though an exception has occurred and the flow will route to the catch exception step. If using this approach, keep the following things in mind. The step shown as failing on by catch exception step will be the throw exception. It will not be the step that has the behavior you want to report. The exception message, trace, etc. will be related to throw exception. Nested in this message will be the text you pass through the exception. This can make deciphering the error result. Another approach that provides more control is to use a create data step. Rather than a throw exception step, initialize the values you want to pass to your error handling flow, such as flow name, step name, exception, message, etc. Set these values on create data step and then connect it to error handling subflow. So now the next important topic is routing after an error. So the most difficult part of any exception handling process is figuring out what to do in a flow after the error has been dealt with. So this includes, should the flow pass until the error is fixed? Should the error be handled asynchronously and the flow needs to be proceeded? Or does the flow needs to restart? Or does the entire process need to fail because this part has been failed? These are the questions that can only be answered through the discussion with the prospect or with the required teams. But always ask yourself what should happen to the process as a whole if an error occurs at this point. So this logical decision makes it much more easy for the end user to see what is expected out of this particular behavior. Also, add additional outcome paths. When working with error handling in subflows where the parent flow should not progress after an error, add an error outcome path to the flow. Now the parent flow can easily route based on whether an error occurred. The last topic of the conversation today is about reporting the errors. So when we are speaking about on reporting of the errors, the foremost thing that needs to be kept in mind is exception handling projects includes 3 dashboards to provide insights into ongoing exception. That includes error reports, error analytics, and exception history. Error reports report of an open exception assignments and graph of incoming tickets for the last 7 days, while error analytics gives us a metrics on open exceptions. The exception history is a report of all open and resolved exceptions. So depending upon our requirement, we can present all of these reports or we can only pick the report that we are required to represent. Errors from data flows using the handle errors for forms flow must be resolved from the exception history dashboard rather than the error reports dashboard, as they will not have any assignments to complete. So to keep in mind that any flows or any exception flows that have forms needs to be handled via exception history dashboard instead of a error reports dashboard. So this is all from the concept point of view. Now let's quickly jump on to the studio and see how these errors can be handled by creating a simple use case where we will try to explore on throw exception step, catch exception step, and logging of these errors.
So I'm back in my studio and I'll be taking you through on how we can catch exceptions and handle exceptions on decisions. So we are currently on our version 8. So let's go ahead and quickly create a flow in order to see how exceptions can be caught on decisions. Let's create a simple test flow to catch the exceptions. And this takes us right into the blank canvas. Let's add a simple step, which is an add step. And as we do that, now this add step would be looking for certain inputs. So I would not be adding any of the inputs over here since we would like to catch the exceptions right over here. So the first one, as we discussed, is a throw exception step. So as we type in our steps toolbox, we have the throw exception, throw business rule exception, and throw non-catchable exception type. So let's keep it simple and click on throw exception. So as you see, the inputs for throw exception step is a message. So what type of message would we like to send or display to the end user? So we can keep it as select from flow or we can keep it as constant. So let's keep that there are no inputs passed in. And here, the unique way is currently the add step is throwing errors if null is not expected, and it only throws errors at that point of time once we map the inputs. But in this case, we would also like to add an outcome for exception. So by clicking on this, we would be able to connect the exception path to the throw exception step. And now we can connect back the done path to the end step. So as you see, this looks good. And once we click on debug, we would be able to see how this exception works. So on clicking on debug, we would now be able to see on how the exception has been occurred. So this over here has been executed. Since we have an exception path, there is no exception. This got executed. And as we click on here, you can see there is no output data. There is only an exception message. So we can log all of this message on our output path, or we can also pass in just the message that we wanted to display on the throw exception step. So by clicking on the throw exception step, we would be able to see that the input, these are the inputs, and the exception is there is no data, and this is the message. So this is about the throw exception step. We can also add subflows Like for example, let me just save this flow and take you back to the Designer Studio. So I have already created some of the error handling flows. So here under flows, we have an error handling flow, which is already inbuilt. So what this flow does is it identifies all the errors and keeps a log of the exceptions that did occur in the process, and assigns as an assignment to the user whom we would like to inform about the error. So this is a complete error handling flow. In addition to that, we also have an error handling dashboard where all of our errors are being recorded. So as you see, currently there were issues or the errors reported related to other things like client rules. So once we run our flow with the catch exception step, those also would be recorded right over here. So let me just jump back into our test errors flow. And over here, if I just remove the throw exception step and add the subflow, right from here, we have it. And on exception, let's keep this as a subflow. And okay, before that, we also need to add our catch exception step. So when we keep this catch exception step, it asks for on how or what needs to be handled when we use a catch exception step. So let's go ahead and unselect the catch exception over here. And now connect back the catch exception step to the subflow that we are looking for. So this over here requires a flow. So now let's go into the one that we just looked into, handle errors for forms, or let's go ahead into this all, my apps. This is under all, this is under utilities, error handling, we are under flows, handle errors flow. Let's pick this up. And once this is done, let's connect this to the end process. As you see, the error handling flow requires certain inputs, that is current flow ID. So let's go ahead and pass in the current flow ID from our flow data. So current flow ID. We also have an error message, which we can pass in to override the required message. So we can keep it constant or we can ignore the existing override message. So I would like to keep this as existing and I don't want to override this, so I'm ignoring this. But in case if you want to show something like this is an issue that occurred in the flow, we can type it right over here, and this is the message that gets displayed. So for now, let's ignore this. So we have all the information which is pre-filled because the exception full trace is coming right from here. It is automatically getting mapped. There is exception stack, exception type, and extra details. So here, let's keep it as merge plain text and pass in some user information like current user email has broke this flow with no inputs. So this is the message that gets captured in the extra details, and we have flow name. We can have the log level or the log severity. Let's keep this constant. So as discussed in our slides, there is a list of logs that we can capture the category, like whether it is a warning, whether it is an error or fatal, depending on how we want to expose it to the end user. So let's keep it as an error type. And we also have the ability to assign an assignments or not to assign assignments to the existing users. So when we click on constant, we can mark this if the assignments needs to be passed in or not. So for now, let's uncheck this one because we want an assignment to be triggered to the user. So I'll keep this, and here override assignees is something whom we want to assign the users to. So as I want to keep it to myself, I'll pass in as a build array and pick flow data, current user email, and override button name. So here, this is the message that gets appeared on the form or the assignment. So let's keep this as fix the issue. This is the button name that gets displayed, and on the project name, let's keep it as constant. And this is error handling project. Let's keep this. And reporting user would be self. So let's pick this from here, flow data, current user email. And as you see, this looks good. So now when we click on debug, the catch exception would capture the exception and then assign it to the handle errors flow and get executed. So let's go ahead and debug this. And as soon as we click on debug, you would now able to see that the error handling message has been appeared. So as you see, there are errors in this flow, and this has been assigned to the reporting user that we have just assigned. And the button that we used for override the message button is right over here, fix the issue. It has all the information, other information like project name, which is error handling project, the exception stack, the exception message that sends us what is actually the exception that caused this, and the entire full trace of this message. So when we click on the fix the issue, it would take us to the next one. And now over here, it would actually ask us to resolve this issue with the comments. So when we click on this, whether we can mark it as a fixed or can't resolve, or if it is an external issue. So we can click on fixed, we can resolve the comments. This is because inputs are not passed in. We can type in the message and click on complete. And as you see, the flow gets executed. So this is how the catch exception step works, and we can actually run a subflow or individual subflows on catching exception and execute each one of them. So now if we just pass in the inputs over here, let's say 10, and we also pass another one as 20, now you can notice the exception would not occur because we have passed in the inputs, and this went down to a full execution path, and we can see the output data. So this is about how the exceptions are handled using throw exception as well as catch exception step. In addition to this, we also have a log which lets us to add the log step. So when we click on log step, we would be able to see the logs. So let me just enter, and there is a log. So instead of handling errors, we can also connect the catch exception to the log step. And once this is done, we would also be able to record the errors or show these errors under the log step. So as you see, the log step is asking for the type, and also we can pick whether it is an error log or whether it is a fatal log or it is just the debugging, and we can show the message right over here. So this error is caused by certain person. So we would like to just add the flow data, and here we would like to add the email address, and we would also like to say the message is, let's pass in the exception message that came in. So we just pass this, and once we debug, we would be able to, oh, now we have not remapped this. So let's go back and keep this as clear and keep this as clear. So now there is a error. So let's debug this. As you see, the catch exception step has captured the issue and it went to the log. So if we see the input output data, we would be able to see that this log has been captured, and we can see the input data. This error has been caused by so and so person, and this is the message. So all these logs as well as the catch exception are recorded and can be observed on the dashboard. So now let's go back to the dashboard and see how these logs have been captured. So this is all about testing these logs, catch exception step, as well as throw exception step. Now I will be taking you back to the dashboard and see how these errors have been recorded. So we are back in the Designer Studio. So let me just go back into the error handling dashboard that we have just created for this use case. And as you see, while we executed the previous flow, the test errors flow in debug, there is an error which got captured. So for this date, and this is under the test errors, and the step name is add, and here is the project info. And as we click on this, we can go into the flow or we can go into the folder. So let's go ahead and run this flow again so that we can see any of the current exception assignments and see one more error on this flow. So let me just go under my apps and run this flow. So when we run this flow, there is an error that got executed, and this is the assignment that got triggered to this particular user with all the information right over here. So if I just go back under error handling flow or the dashboard, now we can see the existing assignment and we can take action on this assignment right from here. And if we click on the errors that have been generated, we can see one more error right over here. So this is the error that just got placed in, and as we click over here, we can view the error details. Another way we can handle these errors is going back into our inbox and checking on the errors. So here is our error. And when we click on here, we would be able to see the exact error with the project name, reporting user, what the exception message is. And here is the override button that we have renamed this. So if we just click on here, we would be able to choose the closing type, whether we have fixed this issue or we can resolve it, or whether it is an external error. If we say if it is fixed, we can pass in the comment, this is due to no inputs on add step. And by clicking on complete, the error would now disappear. And if we go back into the error handling dashboard, now there would be no exception assignments as on date. And you can see there are 2 assignments or tickets that did occur in the last 7 days, which is especially on this particular date. So I'll click here once again, and you can see the 2 test errors. So another way to see the logs or exception is go under system. And here we do have another way, that is go under administration, and we have our system notification, system tools, and here we go as logging. And you can see our log is recorded right over here. So we have created a log under the name test errors, and this was an error type. And we can see that the flow ID and all the other information under the logging as well. So all the logs will be recorded right over here with the timestamp as well as the message. So this is all about error handling and how do we handle errors on decisions. If we have any further queries, we can always refer to documentation.decisions.com and look into that particular query that we have related to error handling or might be any other thing. So this is all about error handling on version 8. So thank you for staying on this session and have a great day.